Hello, fellow foodies. Dr. Cassandra Quave here with Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. On this episode, we're going to take a closer look at the plants and medical traditions of Oman, which is situated in the Arabian Peninsula. Our guest today is Dr. Darach Lupton. He's an ethnobotanist who manages the collection and documentation of plants and seeds from across Oman in his role at the Oman Botanic Garden. Darach originally studied horticulture at the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland in Dublin, followed by a PhD in botany at Trinity College Dublin. In 2010, he joined the Oman Botanic Garden and has been doing some really amazing work there ever since. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Darach. It's great to see you.
Hey, Cassie, nice to see you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Wow,
really appreciate it.
It's great. It's amazing how technology can unite us from across the globe, literally.
Yeah, incredible, yeah.
Yeah. So I thought maybe we could start with just a little bit of an introduction to what is the Oman Botanic Garden and kind of what's the background there.
Okay, so the garden is unique immediately in the sense that it's only focusing on the native plants of Oman. You know, typically botanic gardens will have plants from all over the world, maybe with a small section dealing with the native flora of that particular country. But here we're only collecting and growing native plants. So the garden was first signed into royal decree in 2006. And at that point, they had to decide, okay, where do we locate this place? How big is it going to be? What will the concept be? So a master plan was initiated at that point. It took a year or two for the master plan to be finalized. During that period, then the site was selected. Now, the site is about 15, 20 miles north of Muscat, the capital city of Oman. It's close to the highway, but it's in a very beautiful area, sort of hidden behind the mountains. Oh. So the area itself has a real beauty, you know, an inherent beauty. Even if we did nothing with the site, it still looks really incredible. In 2008, then that area was fenced off. It's an area of about 340 hectares, so it's really, really big, massive site. And if you visit that site now, if there was nothing else done, only the fence put up, which has eliminated all of the grazing. There's no camels, there's no goats, there's nothing on the site. The place has recovered incredibly. It's really green. Once we get a flush of rain, all of the trees, burst into new leaf. All of the annuals come into flush. It's really, really incredible. So with that concept in mind, growing only native plants, the flora of Oman is about just over 1,400 species, almost none of which have ever been grown before. So we're starting off with zero, with a grand plan to grow all of these plants in naturalistic habitats. So part of the original idea was to identify what are the key habitats in Oman. So in the early days, it was decided that there are 7 main habitats we're going to focus on. Within those habitats, there's different numbers of species, different levels of diversity, and so on. So the Oman, if you look at Oman from the south, right on the Yemen border, we have an area called Dhofar. And Dhofar is the most species-rich, diverse part of Oman. This has about 800 of the 1,400 species in this area.
Wow. What's the terrain like there? Is it mountainous or?
You have 2 mountainous regions. One in the south, so Dhofar, that I'm talking about, has a mountainous area. It goes up to about 1,900 meters. And in the north, where we are in Muscat, it reaches up to 3,000 meters. So it's really extreme. And both of those mountainous areas, because of their scale, have developed their own very unique floras. But so in the south, you have this Dhofar area, which is basically dry desert dropping down on this very steep, precipitous coastal escarpment straight into the sea. Wow. But during the summer, between June and September, more or less June and September, you have the southwest monsoon coming from India. And this drenches this whole mountainside with fog and really dense fog and moisture for 3 or 4 months. Because of this water in what is a really, really dry place, the vegetation suddenly comes into life. You have actually cloud forest in southern Oman during this period. And you have a very dense tree canopy. You have a really rich understory of shrubs, subshrubs, bulbs, ferns, mosses, things that you would associate with really wet climates. But prior to June, before the rain comes, and after September when it ends, it just goes dry, bone dry immediately. So you have this funny, strange little period of really green environment, full of life, and then suddenly it just stops. So we gotta recreate that in Muscat. So because that's Muscat, it can be above 120 degrees Fahrenheit here in the summertime. Wow. Regularly. So most of those plants, because they're very sensitive and used to cooler, moisture environments during the summer, there needs to be a climatically controlled environment created for them. So one of the habitats is this Dhofar mountain area. And in the Botanic Garden, this is being housed in a giant biome, glass biome, basically 1,200 square meters. It's really enormous. So that is the southern element of the flora contained in the garden. The northern element of the garden also requires a special climatically controlled environment, because the flora of the north, most of the really interesting stuff, like the juniper and the olive and so on, grows up above 1,500 meters. So again, it experiences, it's very dry, it doesn't experience that much rain, but it is very cool. It never reaches the really hot temperatures that Muscat reaches at sea level. So in order for those plants, many endemic species, those olives and junipers and so on, to do well, they need to be within a glasshouse. So the project, in the master plan, it was decided that the project would have these two huge biomes. One would be for the southern flora, and one would be for the high altitude flora in the north. The other habitats then are everything that is outside. So you have a wadi. Wadis are basically dry riverbeds, or temporarily flooded riverbeds. They have their own unique flora. We have gravel deserts. So this is like a hyper arid areas where the substrate is fine gravel and stone. And then we have the true sand deserts, which are, as you would imagine, scenes from Lawrence of Arabia, where you have these rolling sand dunes. And so we're recreating all of those habitats within the garden itself. So the wadi, for example, is being built in an area where there is a natural wadi. So when it rains here, that area will flood. So what we're doing is we're effectively gardening with native plants. So when the visitor comes, they will see native plants looking their best all the time. This is a big issue with native plants in botanic gardens. Often they look very messy and straggly, and the average visitor wants to see something looking a little bit more manicured. So with the wadi, for example, this will effectively be a very, very large pond with an impermeable membrane beneath the stones. So the visitor won't see this impermeable layer. They will just see water. They will see the rocks and the marginal plants growing along the edges. But so it'll be kept permanently wet.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
And so, Darach, part of your role is also in leading these ethnobotanical expeditions. So you're collecting these wild native species for the garden, but you're also working with local people. Can maybe, I mean, and I guess the ethnobotany would be quite different in different parts of the country as well, because they have different flora. Can you maybe paint a picture of what does a typical rural village look like in the South?
Okay. So because you have, Oman is made up of multiple tribes historically. So the South and the North are very different places, and the languages are completely different. So you have traditional villages in the North, in the center, and in the South, but they're all quite different in how they operate. They're quite different in the plant species that they use traditionally. They're very different in their languages. So if you're looking at the South, right down towards Yemen, you have tribal people down there. The local people are Jibali. This is their heritage. This is the language they speak. It is not at all related to Arabic. You have Dhofari tribe people who speak a Dhofari Arabic. So it has a root in Arabic, but it's quite different. Then you move to the center of Oman, where you have these large gravel, flat, open, very harsh environments. You have Harisi people there, and they speak their own language. Then if you go to the interior, you have the sand areas, which are traditionally where the Bedouin people will live and still do. Then into Muscat, northern Oman, where you have the high mountains, you have, I guess, what you would call traditional Omani Arabic people. And then as you move right to the very north, if you go to the very tip of Oman, you are 25 miles, if not less, from southern Iran. So you're right across the Strait of Hormuz. You can see the lights of southern Iran at nighttime when you're camping on the mountains. So those people there speak also, they have a language there called Khamzari, which is related to Persian more than it is to Arabic to some degree. Also, their culture is quite Persian as opposed to Arabic. So what you have is traditional cultures, quite varied in how they live, the style of housing. For example, in the southern Oman with the Dofari people, their houses tend to have pitched roofs because they have rain and they have wet environment for at least 4 or 5 months of the year. You know, flat roof doesn't make any sense if you're getting a lot of rain, obviously. So they have evolved the system of building houses with circular houses with pitched roofs. In the north, it's quite different. You have traditional houses are block shaped with small windows. Windows tend to be north facing, you know, because you're trying to reduce the heat buildup in the houses. But botanically speaking, if we're looking at traditional plant uses, medicine, craft, and so on, all of these villages have incorporated in their past a huge array of traditional plant uses. And what's fascinating in Oman is that many of these uses are still fully active. So if I was to take you tomorrow to the mountains and let's say 2 or 3 hours from Muscat, we would very quickly be in traditional villages where people are still using plants, native plants that they collect in the wild for everything from basic healthcare. I mean, serious health issues, people now, will travel to the hospital and take on the usual modern treatment. But for basic things like headaches, stomach ailments, religious ceremonies, and so on, that native plants are still widely used. As is the case in most parts of the world, this information, the information relating to how a plant is collected, when it's collected, how it's used, and so on, is an oral tradition. So very little has been written down over the centuries. But again, as is seen in many parts of the world, a lot of this information and this knowledge is disappearing. There's a huge mass exodus of young people from these villages towards the city for the typical reasons. So one of the things that we're doing at Oman Botanic Garden is, rather than doing any real serious applied research, we're quickly running around grabbing this information as quickly as we can.
Before it's lost. That's so important.
Yeah, because literally we're talking a couple of decades and all of this would be gone. I mean, you can see in Oman, since the 1970s, Oman has gone through a huge amount of development. And with that development has come pressure on this type of knowledge. So we have myself and 2 or sometimes 3 colleagues are in the field constantly collecting information. So this, ethnobotanical research or data collection is quite a slow process. You've got to develop a relationship with the people. They've got to understand what you're doing. They've got to agree and, be comfortable with what they're sharing. And we have had huge success. I mean, the elders in these villages are extremely talkative, very, very open to sharing information. They understand themselves that, they're getting old themselves and their grandkids or their own kids are just not really engaged anymore.
Yeah. Well, what are you doing then with this knowledge as it's being documented? Is this also being integrated into the educational mission of the garden itself, so it can be a nationwide resource?
Yeah. So yeah, we have a couple of things we're doing with the data. So we initially just have a garden plant database that we use. So at the very basic level, when that information comes back, we have audio, video, and written and data. So we have a repository for all of this on our database. So we have a pretty extensive library now of information, both audio and video. All of that is being used to populate the education program. And I should say that one of the main functions of the garden is education and the promotion of environmental knowledge and understanding and so And a key part of that is the safeguarding of and the passing on of the ethnobotanical traditions of Oman. So all of our education programs, which we're busy writing, one of the great things about this project is it is never dull. You are constantly doing something different. You might say you're a botanist, but this is merely a title. You could be involved in everything from proofreading education documents to visitors coming and going and so on. So it's really varied.
That's great. That's great. Well, I'm wondering also, so in addition to knowledge of wild plants for medicine and crafts and food, can you tell us a bit about what local agriculture looks like in the country? I know from prior trips I've taken just a bit north of Oman to the United Arab Emirates that dates play a really big role in local cultivation.
Yeah.
What plants are grown there? Which plants are really important to the local diet?
Okay, so again, it varies from north to south because of the climatic differences. So as you say, dates are extremely important, both in terms of culture. I mean, it's such a long link and association with dates here. But in the south, for example, you are really in, like, it feels like East Africa when you're in the south. You have it's much more tropical. So you have cultivation of huge coconut groves, a lot of bananas. They would be the main staple in the south, and they are exported from southern Oman. So that's something that you don't see in the north. Obviously, the environment is too dry in the north for that type of thing. Bananas, you do have certain farms in the north along the coastal area where they grow bananas. But what's happened is over the last 30, 40 years, the levels of salination, soil salination, have really gone very, very high. So a lot of this land on the coastal plains, which was at one time quite fertile, has become really barren. So we're seeing lots of problems. Many farms are shutting down. There seems to be a shift to sort of internal farming now, sort of vertical farming, if you know what I mean, using hydroponics.
Yeah. So salination, how does the introduction of salt happen? Is this just from being close to the coastline and having exposure to salt,
Yeah, it's just the using. I think it's in the early days we're using desalinated water that wasn't great. You get an accumulation of salt then through rapid evaporation, and this has just happened. I mean, probably to start with, the soil salt levels are quite high.
Mm-hmm.
Given it's a coastal area in Arabia, I would imagine you're starting at a pretty high point.
Yeah.
So it hasn't taken very long for this to happen. But once you move into the mountains above, let's say 1,000 meters, you get a fantastic patterns of terraced agriculture, which stretch back at least 3,000 or 4,000 years. There are terraces there that are, all these terraces are, if you imagine these images you would see of Bali or something, where you see these beautiful fields, but that's very much what it's like in the northern mountains. These terraces, some of the oldest ones are certainly 3,000 years old. And these are all hand-built using local stone, making soil from manure and sand.
Mm-hmm.
So in these areas are very fertile. And in those areas, you typically have things like garlic, alfalfa as a fodder for animals, onions, cucumbers, tomatoes, and there's still a lot. I mean, there's probably a lot of land races here that haven't really been researched yet. This is what we feel. We part of our research and part of our conservation work is that when we visit a village and we see a farmer growing lentils that look quite unusual, or maybe a cucumber that looks unusual, we collect seed from that farmer. So we're banking all of this seed at the Botanic Garden. It may be something unusual. We don't know, but we don't want to take the chance of losing it,
Yeah, that's great. So you're conserving the genetic diversity in addition to the traditional knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, I remember a number of years ago, you gave a beautiful presentation at one of the annual meetings of Society for Economic Botany. Yeah. And I was so taken by the images that you showed of these terrace gardens. And also there was a unique water system where they could actually control how the fields were watered. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I think that these traditions of land management go beyond just knowledge of the plants themselves. It's actually, how do you shape the environment in a really, to foster resilience in an arid place?
Sure. Yeah, this system you're talking about is called the al-Falaj system. This again dates back certainly 3,000 years. If you go to the very, very old areas, these are basically water channels that were originally carved into the side of mountains. It basically looks like a piping, a gutter. But the more modern, in the last couple of 100 years, have been built using a traditional cement called sarouj. So what they do is, there are different systems. Some are rain-fed and some are spring-fed. But the whole function is that they take water from a source and they direct it towards a village. And the village then will have its terraced agriculture. So there are estimated, I think, more or less 3,000 kilometers of Falaj in northern Oman. So it's hugely vast. And in fact, two or maybe three of the sites are UNESCO World Heritage. They really do represent an incredible link with the past and really phenomenal engineering. So what they do is, in a typical example, and this is happening today, this is not something that was in the past. So in a village, you will have a particular, let's say one householder has a patch of land, maybe 10 meters by 10 meters. He divides those little units up into 1 square meter plots, which are locally called gelba. So these gelba are basically a small flat piece of soil with a raised edge. So it's like a natural bath. And at one side of that gelba, you have a little channel, a little groove cut out where the water can flow in, right? So when it's that farmer's turn to receive water, the guy who looks after the distribution of the water comes along and he has his watch and he says, okay, this guy gets 30 minutes. And he opens up, basically takes out a small stone that has a rag wrapped around it. And that's enough to stop the water flowing. He removes the stone, water flows into that guy's little 1 meter by 1 meter plot. Maybe he's growing onions or garlic or something. He gets his 30 minutes. Then the little gap is closed and the next guy gets his. And this is phenomenal because, like I say, it's a really sensible use of water. No one gets too much, no one gets too little. Everyone gets an even amount and gets what they need.
That's amazing.
Yeah, really... you see it in even to this day, they still use natural sundials in some of the villages. You will have a stick, and maybe a 2 meter high stick fixed on a point in the ground, and they have marked over the centuries lines in the ground, maybe a meter or two in front of it, right? And so basically, as the sun is moving in the sky, it's casting a shadow on these lines, and each time the sun moves to a next line, they know it's covered, like, let's say 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour. So the guy who is watching this, when it reaches the next point, he closes that field. And then he opens the next. I mean, it's incredible.
Wow. So it is just really amazing that I think about examples from different parts of the world. I'm thinking back to some of the work I've done in the Mediterranean off the coast of North Africa on a little island called Pantelleria. And there, water is also it's very scarce. There's no natural source of fresh water on the island. And all that they are able to collect each year is a very small amount, but they do it through the kind of specialized roof design where they collect kind of the rain and morning dew and it goes into a cistern under their houses. And their entire agricultural system is also built around this conservation of water. Even for their viticulture, they actually have little conical trenches where they have their grapevines. They put a little bit of water and it creates this little microenvironment for each plant. And it's just in a time of climate change where we're going to face more and more issues with rising temperatures and with scarcity of water. I just think there's so much that we can learn from these traditions that have been in place for, like you said, for millennia. It's
well, everything down to if you look at, like I said at the start, the way the houses are positioned and designed. So, you don't have big gaping windows facing south. You have small, narrow windows. You reduce the amount of light that's entering the house. You have really thick walls. The houses are really well insulated. So when they cool down, they stay cool. So all of these traditions are well known. I mean, you can find examples of this everywhere in the world in traditional cultures. But Oman is, what I find so wonderful is that you go to any of these places and you're not looking at a museum where this used to happen.
Yeah.
You're in a place where the guy is there with his modern day watch, you know, in most cases, and he's opening and closing little channels in and out of people's fields. And it's really quite extraordinary that this still happens.
That's amazing. Well, when it comes to food sources beyond the plants that are cultivated, I know that in the Arabian Peninsula, camels have played a really important role in local food. And how important are camels, especially to the Bedouin people of Oman?
Yeah, they're highly important, really culturally very significant. I think the camels are in the Arabian Peninsula for the last 3,000 years, as I understand it. So even again in the north and south, you have slightly different relationships with camels, but I think across the board, it's a general concept that the more camels you own, the more prestige it carries. So there is a push for a sheikh, a village leader, to own a lot of camels. You know, it gives him a certain status, which has a knock-on effect, particularly in the south, where camel overgrazing by camels has really decimated a lot of the natural vegetation. And it's a tricky one because you have to keep a balance in a tribal culture like Oman. You need to keep a certain level of peace between people. You have to sort of give certain concessions to certain groups. And one of those concessions, it seems to me anyway, is that people are allowed to have more camels than they actually need, which is having a negative impact. In the north, it's not such a problem. But in the south, it certainly is.
Yeah. And the camels are used primarily, is it for transportation or for milk, or do they eat the meat? Or is it kind of all of the above?
All of those. Yeah, it's transportation, milk, and meat. Also racing, a lot of camel racing.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. So, the meat eaten is a huge amount of camel meat eaten here.
Going back to the garden, you have these educational initiatives. You also have initiatives, it sounds like, with a very strong horticultural bent, because you're trying to cultivate these plants that are otherwise are wild occurring. You have the ethnobotanical repositories of knowledge and video and audio. And then you spoke about your seed banking as well for conservation of genetic diversity. Is there anything else we're missing? It sounds like so much is going on there right now.
Well, like I said, none of these plants almost none of these plants have ever been grown before. So let's imagine day one. What are we going to do? Right, we need to grow the 800 plants from Dhofar. We need to collect the seed. First of all, we need to know where the plants are growing in the field. Then we need to know when they flower, when they produce fruit. Then we need to know how to collect them. Then we need to know when to bring them back to the garden, how we treat them. What are the tricks for germination? When we germinate them, then we need to grow them. So there's a huge series of steps, all of which there were no handbooks for this process. So when we collect seed, now we have a lot of experience. We know where to go, when to go, what to collect, what not to collect, and so on. So when we have the seed bank, sort of serves two functions at the moment. One is when we go to the field and we collect seed, we come back to the garden. All that seed is weighed and processed, and everything is accessioned, and it goes onto the garden's database. So there's a lot of data entry before we start anything, and things like location, soil, geology, altitude, aspect, all of these general sort of environmental characteristics are recorded in the field and entered onto the database. Seed is then processed and weighed. Some of that seed then goes directly to propagation. So the propagation have a huge list of what they need and what they have and what they don't have. So let's say, for example, the team were in the field last week and they collected seed of a tamarind. And the propagation team this is based on meeting almost on a daily basis with the seed bank and propagation team. Propagation say, look, we need 500 tamarindas for the project. We currently have 200, so with a deficit of 300. In order to grow 300 trees successfully, we need to sow about 1,500 seeds. We always sow an awful lot more than we need, because at every stage you lose plants. You won't get full germination. Then when you have seedlings growing, you will often lose 30–40% of your seedlings through handling and root damage and so on. So at each time you're getting less and less and less. So you've got to sow an awful lot more at the start. So the seed bank serves that purpose of supplying seed to propagation, which is a massive daily task. And then the other side of the seed bank is, which we're just really initiating now, is the long-term storage of rare and threatened plants in Oman. So we have partnered now with the Millennium Seed Bank at Kew Gardens, and we are running a project for a couple of purposes. One is to train our team to take the young Omanis, send them to Kew Gardens for seed bank training and really at the cold face of what's happening. They come back to Oman Botanic Garden, full of this enthusiasm and all this fresh new knowledge, and they can then, teach the Omanis, their colleagues, about how to do things. So the situation now is that we have set up a basic seed bank for long-term storage. Basically, we can take seeds down to -20. We have foil bags, we have dehumidifiers and so on. So we're targeting now, there are 267 rare and threatened species in Oman. And our aim is to have all of those in long-term storage, accumulating 30 or 40 species per year for the next couple of years. This is the intention.
Wow. That's incredible. That's going to make such an important contribution to conservation in the region. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's really, the whole concept of a botanic garden in this part of the world is, although gardens in this part of the world are very old, and that is not a new idea, but the idea of having a scientifically based collection is something that is entirely alien. So it's challenging to some degree because we don't have anything to refer to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes people don't really understand what we're doing, and why would you spend all this time collecting these seeds? They're just weeds,
Yeah.
This, it's not unusual, I guess, to have that attitude.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, when it comes to traditional medicine, are there any initiatives to valorize traditional medicines or any kind of phytochemistry work that's planned, or is that something that's kind of not part of the core mission right now?
Well, it's not part of our core mission, but we are partnering. There has been some projects recently with Nizwa, which is a town about 2 hours south of Muscat, has a university, and they are very keen on this particular area. So we had some projects, the genus Comifera, which is the genus of myrrh. So our team, basically partnering with the guys from Nizwa, went to the field. They collected multiple different collections of myrrh from different locations. They were analyzed by the team in Nizwa, and I don't know what the outcome was. I know they published something recently on this, but this is how we're going to work. We will partner. We don't have facilities for this type of thing,
but you can partner with local universities. Yeah. That's fantastic. And Comifera is such an important genus too, that's also threatened in the region, if I understand correctly, because it has to be maintained through these traditional methods.
Yes, yeah. It's the same with frankincense, both from the same family, Persicaceae. So frankincense is, again, a very important medicinal tree. It's also a very important folk tree. Huge historical importance to the region. But it was essential to Oman's early development. I mean, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, during the Roman period.
Yeah, for trade. Yeah.
Yeah. And it still remains, well, every country will tell you we have the best frankincense. And Oman claims to have the best frankincense. I can't argue, but I would say, because I live here, yes, it is the best frankincense.
That's great. That's great.
But there are problems with illegal tapping and so on. So trees are being damaged. I don't know what the impact of climate change will be in that region, but certainly the short term is the problem with illegal tapping.
Yeah. Well, and this is an important piece of information for the listeners, is that myrrh and frankincense, they look like little rocks on this, but it's actually the dried resin that's been tapped from the trees. Yeah. And it has a lot of, I think there have been, a number of studies showing that they have antimicrobial properties and also analgesic or pain relieving properties as well. Yeah.
There's a very good book, if anyone's interested, called The Plants of Dhofar, which was published in 1988 by Tony Miller, who's from Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and Miranda Morris, who's a linguist stroke ethnobotanist. they did an incredible period of research in Dhofar in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. They documented all of the medicinal plants, all of the craft plants, and produced this really beautiful book.
Wow.
It's out of print, but if you can get your hands on it, it's a great resource.
Oh, it sounds amazing. And so, Darach, today is the garden now officially opened, or is it still closed to the public? As it's being built and all the construction's going on.
Yeah, we have. It's not open to the public basically. So, but we do run private tours. We do have school groups coming. We have an educational program which we're testing out basically. So we're trying to develop a good public outreach program, certainly within the local community. So we bring kids in for specialist days. We're trying to link in with the national curriculum at different age levels. So, you know, tying in with science from the very young age to school leaving age. So we test out programs on the local schools. We have research groups that come in, specialists that visit, but all of this would be by appointment, and you know, it's not basically open yet.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, I guess one last question I have for you is a bit more personal. It's how did someone with expertise in Irish flora wind up in the Arabian Peninsula? It's
you're not the first person to ask that question. I think well, I mean, as you know, the process of studying plants is the same really no matter where you are. There are a series of things that you do and you inquire about. The flora of Ireland, you know, obviously is a temperate flora. It's used to a lot more water than they have in Oman. So things are quite different, but the principle is the same. I originally had studied horticulture. So I was very interested in plant propagation, but then, you know, through various experiences, I very much got involved in plant taxonomy. I was very much more interested in the scientific side of things. Went on then to do a botany degree in Dublin, and then carried on to do postgraduate and PhD. I ended up back in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin, working on the Irish flora. I was mainly focusing on rare plants. And during this time, we were asked to assist in the development of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Jordan. So a team of us, we went to Jordan. This was organized by Peter Wise. Do you know Dr. Peter Wise Jackson?
I do, yes.
Okay. So Peter was the director in Dublin before he went to Missouri. So Peter had arranged that a team of us would go to Jordan to assist in the development of their botanic garden, doing vegetation surveys on the site and so on. And I guess somehow subconsciously this sowed a seed, if you pardon the pun, in my mind about arid flora in general. A little did I know that I would be going to Oman a couple of years later. So I think how I ended up in Oman is, I think I really can't remember. It's quite a while ago and it's a bit of a blur, but I know I saw an ad maybe on BGCI's Botanic Garden Conservation International's website. And it was very intriguing because the position clearly wanted a botanist with a horticultural background. And I think that there's not that many people with both skills. And I think they're very, very complementary and really essential to botanic garden functioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I applied for this position. I hadn't mentioned anything to my wife at this point. So it all happened very quickly. Let's say I applied on a Monday. By Friday, I was offered the job, and I still hadn't told my wife. So I came home on the Friday evening. I said, "How would you like to go to Oman?" And she just said, "Where?" So we had to explain where that was. My wife was very keen. You know, she's happy to go. We came out here for a short recce trip for like 4 or 5 days. Went to the garden, met the director, met some of the staff. We were just instantly in love with the whole idea. Oman is such a magical place. You know, it's such a peaceful, wonderful, beautiful country. So, you know, we had to come.
That's great. Wow. Well, I hope to visit someday. I think after listening to these descriptions and also have seen your past presentations on these amazing systems of terrace gardening and the different ecosystems, it just sounds fabulous.
Yeah, it's magical. It really is. Really is.
Yeah.
When all of this coronavirus is if it's ever behind us, you should come.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Darach, for coming on the show. This has been really enlightening.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I hope we see you here someday.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded today on Zoom. You can find all of our former episodes at our website at www.foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find videos of our more recent episodes on our YouTube channel at Teach Ethnobotany. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.